This time we've arrived at my speciality, and a battle which took place on land that many of you have stood on, or will stand on during the battlefields trip, the Battle of the Somme. So as I say, many of you have stood on the scene of Britain's most disastrous day, the first day of the Battle of the Somme, July 1st, 1916. But by the time of the First World War, what you need to remember is battles had changed quite a lot. One of the big changes was that battles didn't last one day. Not like all the battles that we've studied before. The Battle of the Somme lasted not just the 1st of July 1916, but from that day until the 13th of November. So battles were lasting months now. And it only stopped when the ground became too muddy with the winter weather for the British to carry on any longer, attacking the Germans. People often make the mistake of thinking it only lasted for the day of July the 1st, 1916, but although that was the most infamous day, and a disaster for the British Army, it wasn't the last day. I often think of the First World War as a factory war that came after the British and the European industrial revolutions, when factories and industry developed massively. The correct term to use in your exam would be industrial warfare, so don't write factory war, but let me explain why I think of it like this. Industry and technology had developed massively, and it meant by the First World War tremendously, horrifically deadly weapons could be mass-produced in huge numbers. Things like artillery shells full of deadly shrapnel balls, machine guns, or later gas, but also uniforms and other essential army items. Everything came as standard and from huge factories. Now, there's another reason, apart from the massive impact of factories of making the stuff, and because if you look at the battlefield itself, what happened was men were fed into the trenches and corpses and injured soldiers came out the other side. By the First World War, the weaponry had become so deadly that the battlefield was outrageously difficult to survive on, which is why for most of the war soldiers lived in trenches, holes in the ground, only coming out occasionally and mostly at night, unless it was a specific battle like the Somme, because they needed to stay in the trenches to avoid the ridiculously deadly weaponry that was flying around the place. The other problem was that these new deadly weapons were large and heavy, so a machine gun was, as the name sounds, a machine that needed up to 6 people to operate it, and artillery cannons were also massive, so that means attackers couldn't make much use of the new heavy weapons. They could hardly carry them into battle, whereas the defenders, stuck into position with their new deadly weapons in the heavy deadly weapons in place, had a huge advantage. In other words, you couldn't attack with a machine gun, but you could defend with one. That's a big advantage. Anyway, the Battle of the Somme, statistically speaking, was maybe a bit of a draw, or perhaps even a slight German victory, because 400,000 British troops were killed, wounded, or taken prisoner. And the French, who were British allies, lost 200,000. So Britain and France facing the Germans, and the Germans lost 500,000. So the Germans lost 100,000 less men than the combined total of the British and French put together. This can be explained because the Germans were the ones usually defending during the battle, and therefore they had the advantage I was talking about in heavy weapons. However, if you look at the bigger picture, it was a bit of a catastrophe for the Germans in terms of the whole war. So you could say tactical victory for the Germans, which is like small scale looking at the battlefield, but in terms of the whole war, strategic defeat. And because Germany could not afford to lose 500,000 men, whereas Britain still had reserves of manpower in Britain that it could and eventually did call upon. To an analogy, I think. Let's see. A good analogy might be of 2 people gambling and playing cards with one another. One of the people, let's say person A, brings to the table to gamble at cards £1,000, and the other, person B, brings £100, because that's all they can afford. If at the end of the game, person A lost £100 and person B lost £70, well, on looking at statistics, it appears that person B wins, because he lost less money. But person B couldn't afford to lose £70, whereas person A had a big wad of dosh, and £100, though annoying to lose, wouldn't have been a catastrophe in the grand scheme of things. It's the same with the manpower available to the countries by 1916. France, and particularly Britain, had more left, but the Germans were struggling to replace troops even in 1916, 2 years before the war ended. So, strictly speaking, this is a thing you would write in your exam, the battle was a tactical victory for the Germans, but a strategic defeat for them in terms of the whole war. And this strategic defeat thing might explain why General Haig, in overall control of all of the British Army, was willing to keep on pressing the attack for these months over and over again, despite all of the British casualties, sending men out of the trenches to be blown up, machine gunned, and God knows what else. Haig has been criticised as the general who heartlessly sent waves of young British men to their deaths, and is even referred to as a donkey in some older history textbooks. But those that defend Haig might say that he knew that every man lost to the British was a terrible loss, but every man lost to the Germans was an absolute disaster. This mentality would suggest that the Battle of the Somme was, and here's something for your exam, a battle of attrition, whereby the winner would be the one that lasted the longest, like two heavyweight boxers slugging it out for an unlimited number of rounds until one of them drops of exhaustion. Let's look at some specifics. We'll start with the infamous first day, 1st of July 1916. The first day of the Somme was an unquestionable disaster for the British. Before the battle, Field Marshal Haig had to decide on tactics. One of his generals, in command of a section of his army at the Somme, called Sir Henry Rawlinson, argued that the old method of softening up the enemy with artillery before sending in huge waves of infantry was a bit outdated and shouldn't be used. And if you think back to Waterloo, 101 years before the Battle of the Somme, Napoleon had tried the same sort of thing, tried to soften up the British with artillery before sending in a massed attack of infantry. So such tactics were at least 101 years old. Rawlinson argued that instead the British should aim for small attacks on selected targets and push the Germans back piece by piece. Sadly for many of the British troops who would go over the top on the 1st of July, Haig disagreed with Rawlinson. He didn't believe that his army, which were made up mostly of volunteers and not regular soldiers, he didn't believe they could carry out any complex manoeuvres. And instead he put his faith in the destructive force of the artillery. The plan was for a week-long bombardment, 7 days, 7 nights, continuous, boom, boom. And then 120,000 infantrymen were to simply get out the trenches, walk across no man's land, and take control of the German lines, because the Germans would be almost completely obliterated. And when the British got into the German lines, they'd eliminate any stragglers that were left, that the artillery had managed to miss somehow. The whole walking across no man's land has been a big part of why Haig was referred to as a donkey. One suggestion is that he ordered the men to walk because he wanted his officers to be able to keep control of the inexperienced troops, many of whom were in their first ever battle, and they'd come from all walks of life. They were butchers, teachers, bankers, people working in factories. They weren't career soldiers. But it's also true that the soldiers that he sent were carrying so much equipment in the hope that their attack would carry on for a while, that it would have been impossible for them to do anything other than walk for any period of time anyway, because they were carrying so much stuff. The problem with this whole plan is it relied on the artillery being so destructive. And the artillery barrage looked like it was being outrageously destructive. It lasted for 7 days and 7 nights of continuous fire. The Germans called it drum fire because it was just constant hammering, bang, 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 above their heads. And it tortured the Germans and sent some of them literally crazy. I mean, some of them just could not stand it and their nerves broke. Most of the Germans were completely safe. They'd occupied the trenches on the Somme for 2 years and had spent their time digging deep dugouts far below ground in case this very thing would happen, and it was something that the British couldn't have seen. Only a direct hit with a high explosive shell could have collapsed the dugout and killed the occupants. Another problem was that in preparation for the week-long bombardment, the British had needed literally millions of artillery shells, so factories went into full production mode, but they were often made in a hurry, and often made by people who were new to making artillery shells, and many of them were young women who'd never had any experience of touching explosives before they patriotically volunteered their services to such a dangerous job in the country's time of need. So, if I asked you to start randomly making artillery shells, you'd probably not be great at it to begin with. And lots of the shells fired were duds, which means they didn't work. I've even got one of those dud shells in my cupboard at school. Another problem, apart from the duds, and the fact that the Germans were deep underground and could only be hit by high explosive shells, was the fact that many of the shells were in fact shrapnel shells, full of deadly little metal balls that would be timed to explode in the air and kill men. They were the two main types. You get high explosive shells and shrapnel shells. Shrapnel shells were the biggest killers during the war, but they were totally useless if the Germans were underground, which they were. So only a direct hit by an explosive shell, which exploded on impact, could have buried the Germans in their dugouts. But the Germans, well, they were being attacked with shrapnel shells, and so therefore they didn't usually get buried. I mean, not all of the shells were shrapnel shells, but loads of them were, and too many to make this artillery bombardment effective if the Germans were underground. Oh dearie me. So it became a race to the German trenches. If the Germans could get out of their dugouts and to the trench and set up the machine guns before the British reached the German trench at the other side of no man's land, then the British would have a very hard time of it. Luckily for the Germans, weighed down by their heavy kit and confident that no German could have survived the bombardment, most of the British troops walked. Also, shrapnel hadn't been good at cutting the German barbed wire, so even those few British troops that did get as far as the German trenches found they couldn't get through the thick belts of barbed wire in front of the trenches anyway. Now, so the race didn't really work out so well. Usually you lose a race if you choose to walk, and then the barbed wire stopped them even if they did get there. The result of all of this was 60,000 British casualties on the first day of the battle, including 20,000 dead, 40,000 wounded, missing or taken prisoner. A disaster, quite clearly, by any measure. The battle continued for 5 more months. However, after the disastrous first day, Haig was willing to let his generals alter their tactics a bit and aim for some smaller targets, as suggested by Rawlinson. In some cases, this was very successful, and for example, on the 22nd of July, an attack by Rawlinson's troops captured 3 miles of German trenches, which was a huge achievement by First World War standards. But mostly it sort of continued as the same pattern of artillery bombardment and then massed infantry attack. Later in the battle, in September, tanks were used in warfare for the first time ever. Interesting fact, Winston Churchill, at the time, Lord of the Admiralty, and not Prime Minister till the Second World War, which means Lord of the Admiralty, by the way, in charge of the Navy, well, he got wind of these tanks and immediately wanted to get involved. Also, there is controversy about why these armoured military vehicles were called tanks at all. Some suggest it was a bit of an attempt to fool any German spies or any German aeroplanes who spotted them with, I should say, pilots. Aeroplanes don't have eyes, do they? Any German pilots in aeroplanes who spotted them, because if they had the tanks labelled water tanks on the side, because they kind of looked a little bit like they could have been when they were being transported to the Somme. We're not quite sure if that's what they were being what they were doing, whether it was because they looked like water tanks and so therefore we called them water tanks, or it was an attempt to fool the Germans. But either way, the name stuck, even though nobody's 100% sure what the real reason was. Anyway, the first tanks absolutely terrified the Germans. They'd never seen anything like the noisy metal monsters that spewed forth death and destruction. And because tanks had only just been invented, anti-tank guns hadn't been invented. There was very little the Germans could do. And the initial attack had some success, but sadly for the British, and thankfully for the Germans, the new tanks were unreliable and most of them broke down. So the Germans didn't have to disable them. The Germans soon after found ways to destroy tanks and they adapted. But tanks were to play a huge part in warfare forever after, really, up until the present day. So to summarise for your exam, these are the things you need to know. On one hand, people support Haig. They said that he knew what he was doing, sending men into the attack for 5 long months, because it was keeping up the pressure on the Germans, who couldn't afford the losses. So they suggest that he was purposefully fighting a battle of attrition to wear down the Germans. They also defend him by saying, well, what else could he have done when the Germans were on Allied land? He couldn't have just sat on the defensive, especially when the Russians needed to be beaten quickly, because the Germans were in the process of finishing off the Russians at the other side, and if they did, which they did in 1917, they could transfer loads more troops across to fight the British and the French. He also had the French in his ear saying, we need to beat the Germans and kick them off of French land, because there was millions and millions and millions of pounds worth of damage being caused to France by the trenches being in there. So the defenders of Haig said he had to attack, and that he was doing it to wear down the Germans particularly. Also, Haig wasn't the only First World War general to believe in artillery barrage followed by massed infantry attack. In fact, most of them used that method. However, on the other hand, people are quite critical of General Haig. They say he should have listened to the advice of other generals like Rawlinson and explored new tactics instead of this artillery followed by massed infantry attacks, because they were a feature of the full 5 months, and he never really learnt from his mistakes. He just continued using artillery and mass infantry attacks for most of the battle, which led to, as we've seen, 400,000 British men dying. Anyway, there are documentaries aplenty on both General Haig and the Somme if you look in places like the BBC iPlayer or YouTube, in addition to countless books and magazine articles and so on and so forth. Some defend Haig, and some suggest he was a bit of a donkey. You'll have to make up your own mind. Here are some past exam questions, as ever, to help you think about what you could be asked in your exams.